A few years ago, Howie Mandel was on the Howard Stern show and had a panic attack triggered by a door handle. He was on live radio wanting to exit the room. He couldn't bring himself to touch it. He tried to get someone else to touch it for him. And when they didn't and challenged him to do it himself, he revealed his OCD, thinking they were in commercial, when unbeknownst to him, they were still on air, full broadcast. So in front of millions of listeners, the OCD diagnosis he had held in secrecy for decades was exposed. Hello, and welcome to the Dr. Suzette Glasner podcast. Howie Mandel spent decades suffering in silence with OCD and addiction. I'm Dr. Suzette Glasner. Welcome to the Dr. Suzette Glasner podcast. Today, we're talking about how Mandel transformed his pain into purpose, what OCD is really like from the inside, and the surprising elements it has in common with addiction.
I walked outside devastated, thinking I had embarrassed and humiliated my kids and my family. I'll never work again. Who's going to hire somebody that has a mental health problem? I was contemplating running straight into traffic in Manhattan, standing on the sidewalk when somebody came up to me and said, "Are you Howie Mandel?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "I just heard you on Howard Stern." And I go, "This is it." But then he went, "I suffer from it too. And it was so good to hear you talk. Thank you." And then I went home and I started getting letters, tons of letters.
This gets me choked up because by you accidentally doing that guy knew he wasn't alone. And who knows who he helped after that.
So just a couple of words from a stranger changed Howie Mandel's life, just knowing that he wasn't alone. And that's the power of talking about deeply personal vulnerabilities, especially when shame and fear of judgment are behind keeping it quiet. Now, Howie is not the only one.
You know, one of the things that people don't talk about a lot with OCD, my other things, the anxiety and the dyslexia, don't figure in as much as the OCD does to this, which is sometimes it's exhausting. It's so emotionally and mentally exhausting that's one of the things that people don't really say much. It's like, well, okay, so you got all these nutty thoughts in your head or whatever. But mine is so complex, some of my OCD is so complex that it takes real brain power and energy to do this all day long.
And Billy Bob Thornton isn't alone either. Leonardo DiCaprio, Daniel Radcliffe, who you may remember from the Harry Potter series, Justin Timberlake, all have spoken openly about OCD. Howard Hughes, portrayed by DiCaprio in The Aviator, had severe OCD as well as addiction. 8 million Americans have OCD. When someone famous says, "Hey, I've lived with it too," a lot of people who have been hiding hear it and recognize themselves for the first time. And when they say, "I've recovered," or even "I sought treatment and it helped me," that's what gives us hope. Because OCD can be really debilitating, as we'll discuss today. So just to be clear, when we're talking about what OCD is, when people say, "Oh, I'm OCD, I like things a certain way," that's not what we're referring to with a clinical diagnosable condition of OCD. Those are OC personality traits maybe, and most of us fall somewhere on that spectrum from very particular about things to not particular at all. And so sure, you can have some traits of an obsessive compulsive kind of personality, but when we're talking about a diagnosis of a condition of OCD, it's actually quite different. There are two features of OCD, which is a neurobiological condition. The first one is obsessions, and these are sort of intrusive, unwanted thoughts that create a lot of distress. They can be about a number of things. They can be about things that we have maybe deep-seated fears about, contamination, harm. For some people, it's about needing things to be a certain way, so having symmetry, maybe taboo themes for some people. The point is, though, these are intrusive thoughts, they're unwanted, and they cause a lot of distress. So the second component is compulsions, and this is what we naturally do when we feel unwanted sources of distress. We try to get rid of them, right? So compulsions are a person with OCD's way of trying to neutralize that anxiety or get rid of that anxiety. So if the anxiety is about contamination, then you would be cleaning things or you would be washing your hands. If the anxiety is about doing something that's out of character, so for some people, the obsessive anxiety is sort of an imagined fear that they're going to do something that is aggressive or violent towards another person. Typically, people with OCD are not violent people, and these types of intrusive thoughts are not things that they want to act on. In fact, they make them very distressed. So this isn't a person who is planning to commit violence. It's somebody who's having unwanted thoughts about committing an act of violence. So for a person who has those types of obsessions, the compulsion is more typically something psychological. So reassuring themselves in their mind, I'm not a bad person. I'm not a bad person. I'm not going to actually go out and do something harmful, right? Just because I had that image in my head of myself doing something really awful doesn't mean that I'm the kind of person that's going to do that. And that's something a person with OCD can do rather compulsively, reassuring themselves over and over again, or even seeking reassurance from other people that whatever the obsessive thought is telling them or scaring them about isn't true or isn't going to happen. So again, it's obsessions, the intrusive, unwanted thought that's creating distress, and then it's compulsions, which is doing something, whether that's something mental or something physical, like washing your hands, to get rid of the anxiety that those obsessions were causing. The problem is that these compulsive acts actually make the anxiety worse. So it briefly drops, feel a little bit better, but then it comes back. So you do the same thing again to try and get rid of it. And that cycle just sort of escalates and tightens up. So we've gone over the different kinds of OCD, from contamination OCD to harm OCD, or fear of harming people, the need for symmetry or things to be a certain way. What causes this? We could have a whole episode about that, but to boil it down to a few things, it's strongly genetic. It runs in families. It's impairment in brain chemistry, and it has environmental influences such as childhood trauma. So it is sort of a combination of all these different factors. Typically, it starts when people are in their teens or their early 20s. And on average, it takes 9 years before people actually get appropriate help. So let's talk about the 9 years. Why does it take 9 years from the time that OCD symptoms start until people typically get the right treatment? And I'm going to name a few reasons. The first is shame. Mandel thought he was inventing it. When your brain is doing something that's irrational, that doesn't really make sense, but you can't stop, the instinct is to hide it because it feels like it's odd and you're just doing something wrong. So that's the shame factor. The second is misdiagnosis. Stephen Smith, who later co-founded the telehealth OCD platform, NOCD, was a college quarterback when he started to experience OCD symptoms. And he went from starting player to being completely homebound in 6 months because his anxiety was so crippling. He was misdiagnosed 6 times before anyone got it right. The third reason is around access. People who deliver treatments for OCD, especially the psychological kind of treatments that we know are super effective, they're specialists and they're not so easy to come by. So people often end up in a period of waiting as long as 6 or 7 months to get the right kind of treatment. Before platforms like NOCD emerged, there really wasn't a quick way to access evidence-based care that was affordable for this condition. But there is a fourth barrier that is often left out of OCD conversation. And as a psychologist who works at the intersection of mental health and substance use, this is definitely something I'd like to highlight. When anxiety is relentless, it's difficult to find the right kind of treatment for it. People find other ways to cope, other ways to stop their brain from the constant noise that creates so much distress and anxiety and suffering. So alcohol, cannabis, whatever gets you to the place where the anxiety and noise in your head, just for a moment, it goes quiet. That's what people will do. And that's the reason why 25 to 40% of people with OCD either misuse or have an addiction to a substance. And the risk of developing an addiction is 3 to 6 times greater among people with OCD than people who don't have OCD. Mandel experienced OCD symptoms for most of his life, but was not officially diagnosed until he was in his 40s. He has openly discussed his use of substances like alcohol and marijuana to cope, which again is not atypical. The problem when you start using substances compulsively to deal with an obsessive compulsive disorder is that the substances will bring the anxiety down temporarily, but substance use has this effect that we call rebound anxiety. It actually makes the anxiety worse when you're in withdrawal from certain substances such as alcohol or cannabis. So that then intensifies the obsessions, and that intensifies the cravings or the urges to use the substance. And so it really becomes its own kind of compulsive loop. Now, here's a surprising fact about how family and loved ones can actually prolong both OCD and addictive behaviors and contribute to that 9-year wait time. So what makes this pattern with OCD so difficult to break is really not willpower. It's also the people around somebody with OCD who love them and want to see them stop suffering. So the clinical term for it is family accommodation. It's accommodating the OCD in ways where you're trying to help your loved one to not feel anxious. Around 90% of families of somebody with OCD do this every day. And they're sort of taking on the compulsions and supporting them on the person's behalf. So, for example, spraying objects before a person enters the house with sanitizer, or rerouting the mornings so that someone doesn't have to touch the wrong door handle, or repeatedly reassuring somebody that whatever the obsession is in their mind is not true. And these are intuitive things that we would do out of love and to care for somebody. But the research is very consistent. The more a family accommodates OCD, the more severe the OCD becomes.
Everything the kids touched, everything that you touched, it was so demanding.
It was difficult to live like that. But
You gave me the ultimatum.
Yep.
What was the ultimatum?
We can't live in your world, so you have to figure a way to help and live in the real world and get help.
Otherwise, it's over.
Did you think there was a chance the marriage was going to be over?
Yeah. Yes. Did you?
Yes, but I'm not really. I just said it. I
She's
knew
good
you would do
actress
it.
then.
Yeah.
I would do it because I thought the marriage was over.
Yeah.
That's why I did it.
Howie Mandel's wife, Terry, lived this for decades. And the parallel to addiction enabling is really quite direct, because both are driven by love. When we talk about someone enabling a person's addiction, they're often doing the same thing that loved ones of people with OCD do. They are making accommodations to try and reduce the suffering of someone's addiction. So if they run out of money because their addiction has led them to spend it all on drugs, they give them more so that they won't be broke. And if they miss work because of their addiction, maybe they help them come up with an excuse or call in. These are all accommodations, but what they do is they really fuel the disorder because there's no consequences. And without those consequences, without facing up to them, it's really hard to get to a point where you feel motivated to do something to change the status quo. So the intervention for both addiction and OCD isn't withdrawing your love from that person, but it's loving them a different way. And it's what Terry Mandel did, which was drawing a very clear and firm loving line. What Mandel did after that was he sought treatment. He sought out treatment and poured energy into advocacy. He got involved with NOCD, a telehealth company that provides virtual care for OCD. He started speaking publicly, and he really stopped hiding. And that honesty is also the springboard that we often see in addiction recovery. It's the springboard to setting oneself free from addiction. It really starts with the ability to be honest and the willingness to take that risk so that you can sort of begin to unpack what's going on with you to the right people in the right way. So what actually works in terms of treatment? So OCD is actually very treatable. With the right treatment, 60 to 80% of people will respond. And I'll tell you a little bit about what the treatment is, although I've described it a bit. The gold standard is what is known as exposure and response prevention. And what that means is that you're exposing yourself to the thing that you're anxious about, like contamination, maybe exposing yourself to the thoughts that make you anxious about going out and doing something harmful to somebody when you have images in your head of hurting somebody, stabbing them, doing something that you're horrified by. Rather than trying to get rid of or suppress those thoughts, just letting them be there. And then the response prevention. So it's called exposure and response prevention. So you're exposing somebody to the things that they fear, and then you're preventing them from doing the response that their OCD brain is telling them to do. Their OCD brain is telling them, wash your hands. Wash your hands. That has germs. It's dirty. Wash your hands. And you are intentionally exposing yourself to the germs and not responding in the way that your OCD wants you to by washing your hands. And so the core idea behind that is that what's maintaining the OCD is performing those compulsions. If your family is trying to keep things extra sanitized for you because you have OCD, they are supporting your compulsions of excessively sanitizing, cleaning, and minimizing contamination in any way possible. So every time you wash your hands, if you're someone with contamination OCD, you're telling your brain that the fear was real and you have to do this, otherwise something bad is going to happen. So then something happens. The anxiety peaks, and on its own, it comes down every single time. The brain learns the threat is actually not real. And so over the course of treatment, those peaks just get lower and lower. And the circuit in the brain that is responsible for this loop essentially rewires. And this is what we refer to as neuroplasticity, the capacity for our brain to change when we learn things, and you can actually see it on a brain scan. Now, medications are also helpful too. So the medication class called SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, can also help with OCD. So sertraline and fluoxetine are just a couple of examples. They don't fix OCD alone. But combined with exposure and response prevention therapy, they often produce the best outcomes, lowering the anxiety volume enough that exposures can actually become manageable. So some people will really need to get stabilized on medication so they're not so acutely anxious before they participate in exposure activities or in the sort of psychotherapy piece. Treatment is not about silencing OCD forever. And this is another parallel with addiction, just like addiction, where even when you're in long-term recovery and you haven't used drugs or had alcohol for a very long time, it's something that lives in the background that you have to manage in order to stay vigilant enough to address it when the urge arises. So no, you don't have to be in intensive treatment for the long term if you're somebody with an addiction, but you need some ways of keeping it in check and knowing that you're always a person with that vulnerability. So when life brings its natural ups and downs, you just want to be ready to address them with the tools that you have, or re-engage into therapy if you need to in order to navigate one of those waves. And the same goes for OCD. Once you're a person who has had OCD, even if it's been effectively treated and you've been largely free from obsessions and compulsions, they can come back up at times of stress or transition. And it's just about knowing how to manage them and having those treatment providers really accessible at the right moment in time. So I want to leave you with 3 things. 1, OCD, like addiction, is a brain illness, and it's nothing to be ashamed about. The brain's danger detection system is misfiring. That's what OCD is. It's not a character flaw. And as I said, neither is addiction. 2, you are not alone. 8 million Americans, including some very famous and successful people, have suffered from this and mostly kept quiet about it for long periods of time, even decades. 3, treatment works. Exposure and response prevention therapy. There are accessible platforms. Same with addiction. Treatment is very effective, both medication and psychotherapy. The 9-year gap with OCD does not have to be your story. And if you're one of the 4 or so with OCD who has an addiction, you can treat both of them at the same time. And that really is the gold standard, is integrating that treatment. And you can expect to heal from both conditions. That's what we know from research. I hope you learned something valuable today that you can bring into your life. And I look forward to seeing you next time.